Hello, everybody. Dr. Patmos again, and I want to do a little follow up on a video I did yesterday. For those of you who remember, I was reading the New England Journal of Medicine, as I still do, and as I hope you do. In fact, if you're a doctor and you don't have a subscription to the New England Journal of Medicine, shame on you. Every physician should be reading the New England Journal of Medicine every week. And if you have any interest at all in healthcare, or you think you know a little bit about healthcare, you too should be reading the New England Journal of Medicine. It is the best medical journal in the world. So last week there was a very good article about the challenging the idea that there's an epidemic of autism. This article was so good, and it had really great references, and it really showed clearly and conclusively that the reason there's an apparent increase in autism isn't because there's an increase in autism. It's because of diagnostic substitution or diagnostic shifting. What happened was, and it's funny because it talks about Robert Kennedy and it talks about his uncle, John F. Kennedy, who gave a great speech back in the early 1960s where he talked about the problem of intellectual disability in the United States. That at that time was about 2.5% of school-age children were labeled with what's called intellectual disability. It's a nice way of saying retarded. And there was a big concern about that Kennedy, John F. Kennedy had talked about. Well, and what happened was, though the term autism was first coined early in the 20th century, that was referring to a very narrow, very specific thing that is not the autism we talk about today. The term autism was rarely used and only applied to a small subset of patients prior to 1980. In 1980 or the early 1980s, and I remember because I graduated medical school in 1981, started medical school in 1977. That's nearly half a century ago. And I remember, in medicine, we use this thing called the DSM-3. Now it's DSM-5, but it's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. That is basically the textbook of psychiatry. What it does is it takes all of the mental health, behavioral, psychological, psychiatric disorders, and it categorizes them with diagnostic criteria. Well, DSM-3, for the first time, listed the term autism, and it provided diagnostic criteria for it. That's when we began reassigning people who had previously had a diagnosis of intellectual disability or mental retardation or childhood schizophrenia or a whole host of other diagnoses into this new label, this new bucket called autism. So the term autism really, in practical terms, didn't become used until DSM-3. And then as a result of DSM-3 and the diagnostic criteria, those patients and those children who previously were called one thing were now called something else. And that's when autism numbers increased, not because there's an increase in the number of affected children. It reflects a new diagnostic category. An epidemic is not created by creating a new nomenclature. Changing the name of something and then recording it, the numbers under the new name is not an epidemic. It's a semantic issue. It's a bureaucratic issue, an administrative issue. It's not a clinical issue. Well, this New England Journal of Medicine article was so good, it really got me thinking about this. So I wanted to do another follow-up article today. So I just did a little bit of research. I tell you, I love artificial intelligence because if you know how to use it and you know how to do research, you can really dig into data. And I asked very simply, I said, can please compare the prevalence of intellectual disability with autism over the past half century? If it is true that patients with intellectual disability were now placed into a new bucket called autism, that would certainly show a rise in the diagnosis of autism. And it should show a decline in the number of patients or the prevalence of patients with intellectual disability. Lo and behold, that's exactly what the data shows. The overall amount of children with these issues is exactly the same now as it was then. It's about 2.25% of school-age children. Back in the 60s and 50s, we called it intellectual disability. Today, we call it autism. And you can see in the graphs below, it's all in the text below. You can see that as intellectual disability plummeted, autism went up. It's the same thing, it's just nomenclature. So think about this now. Here we have people, most of the people in the United States believe there's an epidemic of autism. Donald Trump, says there's an epidemic of autism. Of course, if there ever was someone with intellectual disability, it's Donald Trump. But he, I said, there's an epidemic of autism, and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is made his whole career out of claiming that there's an epidemic of autism and that vaccines are the reason for it, because autism took off after vaccines became popular. And then, of course, they went into all these other things, at circumcision and Tylenol and all these other things, and and Fruit Loops are the cause of autism. No, autism is the same thing today as it was back then. It's just got a new name. So read the text below. There's two really great graphs in there that show intellectual disability going down, autism going up. It's diagnostic substitution. There is no epidemic of autism. Autism is not caused by vaccines or by Tylenol or by Fruit Loops. And to take the United States of America and turn it back 200 years by eliminating vaccines that save lives because of the mistaken belief that there's an epidemic of autism and it's obviously coming from vaccines is crazy. That's exactly what's happening to this country right now. The United States of America will pay a giant price for this. If this is not reversed, you will see, mark my words, I may not be around. I'm already 74 years old. You never know how long you're going to be around. I may not be around to see this, but mark my words. If we don't turn this around, the United States is going to see, it's already seen, rise and return of deadly contagious childhood infectious diseases, and a lot of children will suffer, die, and be left permanently injured as a result of these neurotropic viruses like measles. And we will find out down the road, years from now, that the whole thing that Robert Kennedy and the MAGA Maha people are talking about is all an artifact. There is no epidemic of autism. It's diagnostic substitution or diagnostic shifting. That's the data. Have a nice evening.